Hey guys, welcome back to the Evolve Move Play podcast, and welcome Gregg. It's great to have you.
Hey, it's great to be here, friend.
So for those of you who don't know, Gregg Henriques is a psychology professor at James Madison University. He's the author of The Unified Theory of Knowledge. And can you remind me of two more technical books that you wrote on this big subject?
I did, yes. A New Unified Theory of Psychology I wrote back in 2011, and then A New Synthesis for Solving the Problem of Psychology, Addressing the Enlightenment Gap. That's a 2022 book I wrote.
Beautiful. And you've been collaborating extensively with our mutual friend, John Vervaeke, on what you guys are terming, I believe, Transcendent Naturalism.
That's exactly right. Yep. We had a bunch of podcast series, what we call the Cognitive Science Show, and that culminated in Transcendent Naturalism. And that actually consists of two parts. One's Extended Naturalism, which is a particular way to approach sort of philosophy of science that makes sense of consciousness. And then there's the strong transcendence idea, which is basically how collectives can get together, create cultural movements that afford transcendence. And our time needs that. And in fact, we have a conference coming up in April 25, 26, an online conference where we're going to be sharing our extended naturalist view of consciousness. We've been working on that together in the last year.
Awesome. That's exciting. So I wanted to start the conversation with actually what you just mentioned, right? What is the Enlightenment Gap? And then, given that John is our kind of mutual friend and collaborator, what is the relationship between the Enlightenment Gap and the crisis of meaning that we are facing?
Great. So the Enlightenment Gap is my term for the fact that we are lacking a reasonable, coherent frame of understanding that binds together our knowledge of science, in particular, say, grounding out in physics, and our understanding of consciousness, our understanding of the social construction of reality. The definition that I offer of the Enlightenment Gap is the fact that we have failed to place mind in relationship to matter, meaning in our theory of how the world is, we don't have a good idea about that. And we don't know how to align our objective scientific knowledge with our subjective phenomenological experience of being and our culturally constructed knowledge. So there's a epistemological and ontological problem that results then in an unsolvable system that has then resulted in the fracturing of our knowledge. And because of that, because we have fractured knowledge, then the idea of authority, the idea of binding together what is and ought, the idea of like how we understand how to live our lives wisely, I think that you would want a binding in relationship to knowledge and wisdom from an educational perspective. The absence of that relates deeply to what John is pointing to in his work on the meaning crisis.
So I think what I'm picking up on that is that essentially by bifurcating the world between mind and matter and treating them as really distinct, we end up in a place where we've been increased our power to manipulate matter and the set of facts or knowledge that's available in our manipulation of matter to an extraordinary degree, and yet have not been able to derive from that any guidance for how we actually live a good life.
Agreed. Yeah. So, and I will say the splitting is kind of ironic in the sense that as physics gets a hold and as we turn from natural philosophy to natural science, the basic ontology picture is, it was a dual world system, supernatural versus natural. And then we kill God, so to speak, and then we're just left with the material. But then you can't get mind back in. So then it becomes very confusing about how to give an honest and real and embodied articulation of what mind is. And as a function of that, then you get a lot of fragmentation. And then you're right. Then a lot of power and technology, but not a lot of wisdom about how to live, for sure.
Yeah, because, what comes up for me is this idea that like if we have a really good theory of how atoms work, then yeah, we can blow shit up. But if we don't know what a mind is or how it relates to things, then how we actually manage our own minds is really not very well elucidated.
Totally. Exactly. In fact, yeah, I get to the Enlightenment Gap through my profession, whereby I'm studying psychology, both as a clinician, so I'm a psychotherapist, but also a theorist and a big picture. And I identify, it's certainly not new, but it's like a way of framing called the problem of psychology, which is psychology as a science can't tell you what its subject matter is, interestingly enough. And that's very different than biology or physics. Science of life, science of energy, matter, relations across scale. Those are very clearly defined as physics and biology, respectively. But psychologists can't really actually tell you with coherence what it is that they study. You talk is fundamentally about getting clear about that. So it's about getting clear what we mean by mind.
Yeah, what is the psyche that is the subject of psychology? And then,
well, actually, I could pause you there. So there's actually right. And is mind psyche? Is that the same thing?
yeah,
And what's the relationship and all that? And that turns out to be very set of complicated questions. You talk gives some, I think, are pretty coherent answers, but we'll see.
yeah. I mean, it strikes me that so my undergrad education was in anthropology, and in anthropology, I think you have a very similar problem, which is that culture is essentially the object of study, and yet there's no consistent, coherent definition of what a culture is and how we sort of elucidate where biology ends and culture begins is
Totally.
Very poorly elucidated. I really like the work of Joseph Henrich in kind of starting to bring those worlds together, and various other cultural sort of evolutionists. But by and large, I think most anthropology is actually nonsense, because essentially culture is a kind of god of the gaps.
Totally.
So,
yep. And UTalk addresses that. In fact, the last chapter, second to last chapter, clarifies what UTalk says about culture, because this whole gap between biology and culture is actually where UTalk comes in and fills in this thing called mindedness. And then once you clarify that, you could actually then clarify what kind of culture we share with other animals, because there are ways to think about, and then what kind of culture becomes quite unique. And then how do you also relate culture to society? UTalk provides a framework for that. But yeah, anthropology has struggled enormously, very similar to how psychology has struggled, and all the disciplines above sort of neuroscience in terms of the ambiguity, because that's where the Enlightenment Gap really takes hold, and our confusion begins.
So one of the things you've already sort of mentioned it, but I guess the starting point for you is, as you just said, like the problem of psychology, which is we don't know what it is. I was listening to you and reading you a little bit in preparation for this, and it made me think of, do you know Eric Houle?
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep.
He wrote
Mm-hmm.
Cognitive Science is Pre-Paradigmatic, right? We don't have the grand evolutionary theory that nullifies biology or Newtonian physics or quantum mechanics in cognitive science.
Yep.
Maybe we do. Maybe John has it, but it's not.
Well, John and I, so the same thing with psychology. So it's pre-multi-paradigmatic. And I think John and I will argue that our synthesis, the synthesis that we each afford in psychology and cognitive science, and the fact that became now a synthesis between us, does exactly that. There is available, I mean, you have to get peer reviewed, and it has to happen in the culture. But from the inside view that John and I have, that we basically solved the problem. Okay. Then the question is whether other people would agree with that or not.
So your aha moment, what was it, 97? Your aha moment was to sort of see this series of emergent phenomenon that are related to each other, from the emergence of matter and time and the Big Bang to the emergence of life, 4 billion years ago, to the emergence of mind. I think you said about 700 million years ago, we can start thinking of living things as having some level of mind. And then I think you said somewhere between 500 and 50,000 years ago. I might push you back to, 1.5 million years ago, depending on kind of your understanding of the paleoanthropology. But somewhere in there, we have the emergence of culture and mindedness. And the claim, which I didn't get a chance to go all the way into your book, but the claim is that at each of these junctions, there's a gap or an inability to understand how they connect, and that solving those gaps gives us a more powerful paradigm to think clearly about the Enlightenment Gap, to think clearly about the psychology gap. So I'm curious why, to solve the psychology gap, we have to go all the way back to, like, matter and time and and these things. Right. So like you were saying that you sent this to Daniel Dennett, and he said, okay, this is unsurprising. I'm like, okay, yes, these all emerge. I think that's an emergentist sort of framework is the default within materialism. So what is the unique insight that comes with the structure of the UTalk tree of knowledge?
Okay, a lot there. So basically, let me say that, in terms of the emerging insight that I have, the first thing I'll simply say is, prior to the Tree of Knowledge insight in 1997, I appreciate you noting that, and that is my biggest single moment of aha-ness, arguably. But prior to that, I had essentially differentiated the cultural, human, psychological, anthropological structure from the animal mind structure through this idea called justification. I called it justification theory then it became justification hypothesis, then it's justification systems theory. I named it a couple of things. Same basic issue, always the same. The emergence of not symbolic language, the emergence of propositional language is a tipping point that gives rise to a particular kind of novel problem called the problem of justification. And it is the problem of justification that catches and binds us. So I would say that we are engaged in symbolic communication, maybe back a million years, but actually in terms of the acceleration of human culture and society, it's the last 500 years, 1,000 years, and then for the last, 100,000 years, we're really seeing this really catch. And the argument is really propositional language has taken off. We can dialogue about that, but whatever. And then what you get there is you get a separation of the variance of human behavior relative to the rest of the animal kingdom. And then I was working with that. And then I had the insight that actually, if I pull off that variance, then the insight, what it does is it maps, well, then there's this entire minded animal variance on the third level. And then beneath that is the living organism variance. And beneath that's a matter object variance. And that all then collapses down into what I call the energy information singularity and implicate order, of which Big Bang sort of points to, and then we can get in all sorts of interesting questions here. But what that essentially then pops as, yes, it's emergent, okay, but emergence how? And emergence in what way? There are a lot of different frames for emergence. I think they're general, and certainly people are around them, but are you a weak emergentist? That's what Daniel Dennett essentially is. He's both a weak emergentist, R.I.P. Dan, that basically says, hey, we can just use the exterior scientific view to understand our behavior. That's actually very compelling in certain regards. But what Dan never responded to me when I said, hey, well, then why is there a problem of psychology, right? If everyone knows this already, why is there a problem of psychology? And the answer is they don't know it already. And they don't know how to carve nature at its joints. What Utah does through the tree of knowledge is it says, yes, there's emergence, there's aggregate emergence. Okay, so like a whirlpool is aggregate emergence. Lots of things can come together and create macroscopic patterning that's defined by the macroscopic pattern relative to the specifics. And then there's complexification, whereby you get a particle into an atom, into a molecule. And Tyler Volk calls this combigenesis. That's another kind of emergence because it's actually a structural functional binding that gives rise to a metastable whole. And then Utah points to a third kind of emergence that says actually there are complexity building feedback loops that produce novel forms of information processing within systems and communication networks between systems. And these create emergent emanating behavioral complexification planes of existence. And that's what life is. It's an emergent emanating plane of existence. And that's what mind is mediated through the nervous system and then animal to animal communication that creates another plane of existence. And then propositional language gives us a novel kind of information processing and communication networks that gives rise to the culture person plane of existence. So if you actually look at the diagram, and it's unsurprising as the way Dan did it initially, then we wouldn't have a problem with psychology. We would have a basic psychology that says, oh, that's the mind, brain, behavior structure of animals, which is fundamentally different than the organisms. And then there's human psychology and the rest of the social sciences, which is mediated by capital C culture and person behavior, which is justificatory. And then we would know what the links are between all of that, just like we know the link between life and matter, which the modern evolutionary synthesis, although it's not complete, affords us a paradigmatic relationship. Natural selection operating on genetics gives rise to organismic complexity. That joint point we're clear on. Why aren't we clear on the other two joint points? If we were, we wouldn't have a problem with psychology. So the response is, no way is that unsurprising. It is radical and different. Yeah, it's emergent, but how, why, what, and how does it solve problems that brings ideas together?
Okay, so there's a couple places that we could really double click on. One would be going back to the justification theory thing, but maybe we'll go forward and talk about that because that's really important. Understanding is how you're sort of conceptualizing how the egoic mind sort of arises. But that was a lot, right? I think for folks who aren't as familiar with you as me, and even for me, it's like there's a lot of density in that series of statements. What I guess where it kind of aligns with my thinking, where my curiosity arises is, so I was an anthropology major, but I became very curious about evolutionary biology and also evolutionary psychology. I was going to, I think it was 2001 when I was sort of diving into evolutionary psych. So not so far, not so different. But one of the key tenets of evolutionary biology is that we at least treat biological systems as non-teleological, right? So there's this idea, we've all seen the chain of evolution where, you start with a chimpanzee and then stage by stage you end up with a human being. And there's a kind of hubris in that to think that we are the sort of object of the evolutionary chain. And you'll hear people say things like, if we evolved from monkeys, why are there still monkeys? Right?
Yeah, you can hear that.
And,
It immediately knows somebody doesn't know what they're talking about, but go ahead. Yep.
well, the reason that people say that is because they accept a teleology there, and they don't recognize that a monkey-like common ancestor can give rise to monkey-like descendants that have themselves been evolving over the last 20 million years since the separation of our lineages. So you have this idea within evolutionary biology where you could say that a paramecium is no less sort of evolved than a human being. It doesn't represent a chain, but it seems to me that there is a kind of evolution, or there's a kind of telos to evolution that is left behind in that, which is the process of complexification. Mm-hmm. A world that is inhabited solely by bacterium does not have as many sort of trophic niches that are occupied. And so over time, the life world has expanded itself through layers of complexity. And a human being is fundamentally much more complex than a paramecium. And in the same sense, a paramecium is much more complex than a, water, H2O. Totally. And H2O is itself more complex than helium.
Yep. Totally.
And so we have actually seen, even prior to biogenesis, a trend of moving from very small, simple things, or maybe not as simple as we think when we actually get down to physics, but it has moved up these chains of complexity. Totally. And I think what you're saying is that something about, what I hear you saying is that something about the sort of implicate order of that initial event created this space into which things could move in that direction. Yep. And that over time, there's an inherent unfolding that brings out the potential for these more complex expressions of that implicate order to arise. Is that a fair description of
yeah, I mean, there are a couple of different ways to frame it. We can start with the weak anthropic principle, which basically says, okay, yeah, what's the trail that led here? And it's a trail of complexification. I describe it, my term, as behavioral complexification. That refers to first the structure of complexification, which is particle to atom to molecule to macromolecule core of the biogenetic structure into a cell, into a multicell, into a multicellular ecological community. And then with the animal kingdom, you get neuron systems binding together to create whole animal movements. And then you get animal group behavior, and then ultimately you get propositions. It's complexification in the sense that what you're happening is you're getting increasing integration and differentiation of parts. Okay, so you get an increasing structure that has nested parts within it. You get increasingly complex behavior patterns that they are mediated through certain kinds of information processing systems. And so this has happened. Now, why has this happened? And what is the underlying causal structure? And meaning, so my friend Bobby Azarian will make the case that, this actually represents a universal learning principle. And then it gets to, that tells us something about the nature of God, potentially. And then he doesn't mean that like necessarily in a Christian God, but there's a whole way in which we can align scientifically this complexification learning process with an underlying structure that the universe almost is alive or seeking a particular structure of organization. I'm open to that interpretation, but there are other interpretations as well that are a little less teleonomic or whatever at the level of the whole, and is more sort of accidental and lucky. Those are different angles on that. U-talk is what's called endo-natural. I'm really interested in just getting the description of what has happened clear, especially then at the level of getting the description of what has happened at the level of mindedness, minded animals, and cultured persons in the overarching system. In terms of the big picture thing, I tend to be kind of on the agnostic. I'm very open to what's called mythos, the idea of it. The science of it is such that then I adopt a more skeptical logos angle. Anyway, I'll pause there. It could go a lot of different directions, but I'll pause there, see how that lands.
Can you describe the difference between like teleonomic, right? So
Right.
end, the end to which something's moving, and gnomic as in, is that knowledge, nomos?
Yeah, I believe so. That's a good question in terms of, and I'm not 100% sure of the exact. So the way I would immediately sort of, there are things that behave within this particular type with a telos that's quite different than the whole overall system has a teleonomy. So in other words, there is an app. You'd really have to make the case from a different kind of angle, say, oh, evolution was trying to get to us. That's essentially an intelligent design telos inside the whole structure. At the same time, organisms and animals and people can clearly be teleonomic in the sense that the only way to describe their behavior is through a goal orientation.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, we want to communicate our ideas on this podcast, and that basically creates an attractor state that allows us, if obstacles come, we'll adjust our behavior accordingly to try to get a good podcast. We clearly have a future goal state in mind. I don't have any problem naturalistically with any of those. The old behaviorists had some claims, and some philosophers have had some problems, but with the emergence of the information processing structures and complex adaptive dynamic systems theory, complexity theory in general, and certainly U-talk, it's very, if you just want to use teleonomic as a description of goal-oriented structures, goal orientation emerges in the universe for sure.
Yeah.
Whether it's goal-oriented is a different question.
The example, I think, is very scientifically robust, at least, and widely considered to be just the replicators idea of Dawkins, right? Like, in order for the natural selection to get off the ground, you have to have a sort of a mode of matter that has a telos of replicating itself. And however that gets going, it's the predecessor of natural selection, because fire is a complex dynamical system. As you mentioned, a whirlpool is a complex dynamic system, but it does not have a inherent drive to move itself towards that which propagates it and away from that which will destroy it. And once we have replicators, then we have those replicators have a telos. They have an end, which is to replicate themselves, which explains their behavior over time. And without that, we don't have any real evolutionary theory.
True. I think that the line where you would locate the energy towards something would be interesting in terms of the relationship to whether, I mean, Dawkins used the selfish gene obviously as a metaphor in one particular way, but also as a complex set of circumstances that give rise to a direction. And so at that level, yes, but genes themselves, whether genes really want to replicate I would certainly say the paramecium wants to approach and avoid. And then just define that behaviorally in a particular sort of way. And then certain kinds of feelings and motivational states emerge in particular kinds of animal-minded structures. And they have then what we are just referring to as desires, goals, etc. And Terence Deacon in Complete Nature does a good job of this at a high level of abstraction, clarifying the logic of all of that from my vantage point.
Yeah. So looking at the organism themselves, there's a telos. And I guess I want to go back for a second because there's something that's interesting. So we're talking about the emergence of these sort of different layers. So on one layer, you have the ability of chemistry to sort of start doing things, right?
Yep. There's a variation selection. All of the major complexity building have the ingredients of a propagating bottom that gives rise to variation. Then there's a hook across through a selection filter that creates differentiation, replication, and then there's selection to maintain that. So variation, selection, rotation is the engine across all the complexity building feedback loops. That's at the to get from inanimate matter to organismic life. You go through that. I argue that mind is actually also a variation, selection, retention structure, and as is the culture. And you can specify what those are. So there's the dynamic ingredients of our variation, selection, retention, and what they do is if they give rise to a novel information processing system, then also then the consequence is an emergent, emanating, complex, adaptive plane of existence, and that's what I would argue, that's what we call life. We should call minded, that all the animals should be that have brains and complex active bodies or should be minded. That's where mind should be defined, and then cultured persons are a layer on top of that. So we sort of have a mind on top of a mind that is this language-based, self-conscious account-giving system. But the underlying process is this underlying generator function of variation, selection, and retention.
So that in some sense, you could say that the universe, in the way that it's set up, has this essential generator function at its core, right? And so, as I mentioned earlier, and this is kind of below or my pay grade, below my operating area, right? I'm in the human space, but I've seen Heather Heying and Brett Weinstein talk about this idea that selection is below life, right? The selective principle actually operates below that, and so we have, right, like just as we have the question like why are we not all bacteria, we also have the question like why the universe isn't just helium and hydrogen or
sure
one of them, right? So in some sense, you have these metastable states of matter that exist at higher levels of complexity that are generated through gravitational forces,
sure
ramming matter into itself, and then some of these things become stable. They give rise to new things that create their stability. Is that a good way to describe what you're referring to there?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, basically, right. So the first thing we're going to do is a base level description that says, yep, what happened? There's a phase transition and hot inflationary big bang or whatever you want to kind of, what's your current model of that transformation that gives rise to a space-time continuum with different energy matter configurations. Those different energy matter configurations across. Now, one of the questions is whether or not it's already inherent inside of this to move towards complexification. That's like if you're a panpsychic, or I think Bobby Azarian might say this, there's an underlying line here, even at the level of particles and atoms that are seeking a variation selection to move toward some kind of complexification. To me, I'd just rather describe it at this stage rather than impute much of a force per se. But you basically, if you have a multiplicity of different environments and you create this sort of dialectic of right level of heat that gives a right level of chaos and order that gives rise to metastable patterns of complexification, well, that's what, lo and behold, on the surface of planet Earth, approximately 4 billion years ago, you had the right ingredients. Most places in the universe don't. I mean, most places in the universe are void, hydrogen, helium. I mean, that's the vast majority of what we can see out there. It's just darkness, hydrogen and helium. It is the case here that, and so there's the lottery function. That's why I meant the weak anthropic. We know we won the lottery. So now we're asking how. Yeah. By definition, if we won a lottery had to have happened and you had to have gotten lucky. And so that's the minimalist. But there are really interesting, deep questions that says this goes really down. And there are a lot of kind of almost spiritual faith questions that you can draw from that. I can go that direction, but I want to make sure I'm wearing that hat. And from wearing my scientist hat, I just want to be describing the process.
Yeah. I've become a theist in the last year. And so I was, a hard materialist until quite recently. And so it's interesting to look at and see something like that. Like, so if you think about the anthropic principle, okay, we live in this Goldilocks zone. It's extraordinarily statistically unlikely. So we can generate explanations like multiverses where there's, an infinite set of infinite universes that somehow, of course, what is it? Survivor bias. We see it totally. Because we happen to exist in the only one. But that seems like just as much a supernatural answer as
Right.
God.
Right. So for at least what UTalk does is UTalk just says, let's be endonatural when we're being endonatural, which means there's a circle to draw around the natural world. I think that's very confused. We have an enlightenment gap as we try to explain the natural world. I'm agnostic what that natural world sits in. I'm not a foundationalist. I'm agnostic. I think there are a lot of different possible narratives. And then you basically get the edge of our naturalistic metaphysics. And then you get into, theological. Well, then there's sort of pure philosophical metaphysic questions. And then there are what I would call sort of more theological, mythological, and I mean that with respect. I have my own mythological metaphysical questions about kind of what does this all mean on the outskirts of that. Not to say that you can't find a lot of meaning in the inskirts of it, but that's what I mean by endonatural myself.
Okay. So endonatural means that within your system of knowledge or your system of justification, your system of, your theory of knowledge, the explanation is to, or the drive is to explain it internally using naturalistic processes rather than try to look for answers sort of coming down emanationally from theological principles.
Right, exactly. So endonaturalism just says, hey, we can do a lot better. Flat physicalism sucks. That's not a good explanation. And Dawkins doesn't get the right, no one's got a good model of emergence. That's why we have the hard problem of consciousness, the problem of psychology, the Enlightenment gap. Within naturalism, those things can be solved a lot better. And that's what UTalk lenses. And all while saying naturalism exists inside of something, an exonatural container, and then other people can point to that. And maybe if psi phenomenon and life after death and all, it may well be that the metaphysics of naturalism, as I understand it, needs to get completely rewritten. I'm open to that. But I'm working mostly with a pretty standard naturalistic frame. I'm upgrading its ontology and emergence, and I'm integrating theories with John Vervaeke and other people to be able to say, oh, I understand human consciousness within this frame. There's not a lot of mystery here. There's certainly mysterious things that happen that point to possible, say, exonatural psi phenomena, etc. But within the confines of a reliable, valid human gross consciousness explaining this conversation, etc., I don't see. UTalk generates with say endonaturalism, because that's really the bridge between me and John, resolves the hard problem of consciousness, basically, as far as I'm concerned.
Okay. I'm curious to dig into that. For some reason, I want to evoke Jonathan Peugeot. Have you ever spoken with Jonathan?
I haven't spoken with him directly. I've certainly seen a number of his videos and know that he's a fascinating character for sure.
Yeah. I was, I guess, pretty hard on the emergentist frame, when I first started speaking with Jonathan. And his perspective is that a lot of times when a sort of materialist points to emergentism, it sounds to him like they're saying, here magic happens. Right. So
right.
Why does, when you take, what's a good example? Here's actually, I don't know. I think that I struggled with this example, but this is an interesting one. So what is like wetness? How does wetness emerge from the underlying thing? And it's like, well, it turns out that, all matter more or less has a fluid state, right? But what does it mean that you can go from a gaseous state to a fluid state? And why does that have this quality of wetness, right? Does UTalk have an answer to that?
Sure. Well, I mean, you want to separate, there's a couple of different things. So when you talk about wetness, are you talking about we as primates in the world then applying language to a particular concept that our shared qualitative experience of being, what we would call mind two in the language that you is experiencing? Or are you talking about, well, we're going to abstract our own phenomenology from it and simply describe fluid dynamics? Okay. So the idea that fluid dynamics emerge out of populations of hydrogen, oxygen, molecular structures doesn't seem to me to be particularly mysterious. And any more than we would say that, there's no traffic when you have one car, there's no such thing as traffic. But if you have lots of cars, you can get this common phenomena of traffic is meaningful. Yeah, the aggregate behavior at certain levels isn't terribly difficult. Yeah. And I would certainly say that, and you could see that the first cone of matter, it basically says there's a complexification process. It's more or less reducible to its foundations. there is a very important jump when we get to life. There's a second jump when we get to mind, a third jump when we get to culture. But I am not a strong emergentist. Okay, nor am I a weak emergentist. John and I, part of our extended naturalism, make very clear why there's an error in the literature that weak is too weak, strong is too strong, and there is a sweet spot which we call extended emergence that affords clarity about how to think effectively about emergence and the way it generates novel phenomenon explanatory wise, but also non-reductively, gives rise to a theory of causal emergence, but is also coherent and is not mysterious at the level of, in the philosophy of mind, strong emergence then tends to these things like qualia are these miraculous kinds of entities. John and I basically was like, you're not framing it correctly. Once you frame it correctly, then you get a totally different angle. At least that's the argument we're making.
Yeah. Okay. So actually, I guess what I wanted to ask you to do is describe the distinction between a strong emergence and weak emergence principle, maybe specifically in relationship to these levels of the tree of knowledge as a good example.
Sure. So anyway, just so your audience is clear, so if you adopt a materialist frame, then you have reduction. Hey, there's causes down the stack, and virtually everybody within a materialist frame has some sort of ontological continuity. Their basic principles, what's called physical closure, essentially requires from a materialist frame ontological continuity and closure with physical causes resulting in physical causes. That's point one. But then the point two is you get all this new stuff in the world. You get wetness, you get stuff happening. And then how do we think about the causal? Is this weak emergence basically says there's aggregate properties, and then you need new language concepts to describe those aggregate properties. People vary in terms of how predictive they are and what elements they point to. But basically they say, hey, the weak emergence says, and somebody like Sean Carroll's, his poetic naturalism is a great example of weak emergence. It just basically says, hey, epistemologically, meaning our knowledge, clearly we need to think about cats as a category. Cats behave in a particular way. This is an example he uses. But cats aren't fundamentally real in the causal ontological structure. Quantum mechanics or the quantum layers where all the real action's happening need to then see patterns behave, but there aren't any novel causal structures beyond electromagnetism, strong, weak nuclear force, and gravity. At least that's what he often sometimes says. John and I would say, no, that's a flat ontology. And so then you say, well, what's actually happening? And we have a whole argument for this. I'll say this since you mentioned the tree of knowledge. I would basically agree with Sean Carroll about the relationship between physics and chemistry, more or less. We would have minor differences, meaning that Sean Carroll says, oh, there's these different elements and there's complexification coming together. They create the aggregates. We can talk about them, but we can more or less reduce them. Notice that if you look at the tree of knowledge, those are 4 upside down cones. You see that the chemistry basically is situated on top of physics, and there's a continuity there. There's a continuity with life, but there's a totally different cone. Okay. I argue that life is a novel plane of existence. And I argue that the higher order structure of information processing communication networks, okay, gives rise to an emergent emanating plane of existence. Now that emergent emanating plane of existence has novel causal structures to it that cannot be reduced to the bottom layer. And the analogy I would give is like early on, you have the ingredients for chess, just the rules that somehow unfold so the pieces are moving according to some rules. But what you don't have is chess players. Yeah. But the evolutionary process has given rise to chess players. So organisms are like playing chess at one dimension. Animals are then playing chess at a whole nother dimension. And persons are playing chess. And the way they play chess is a function of novel causal structures that are not reducible to the material layer. So standard reduction, weak emergence isn't strong enough. But strong emergence gets into things like qualia, and so you'll never be able to explain what qualia is from an emergent perspective. We just have to take it as a given, kind of a miracle. And Jonathan Pageau would be absolutely correct that the materialists will identify qualia as an emergent miracle that could never be explained. That's what Mysterianism is, and it often gets attached to strong emergence. So UTalk says, okay, it accepts weak emergence as sort of a given. That's the evolution of complexification within a cone. it then says, it doesn't say that it's a miracle, but it says that there is unique causal processes. That's why we have these different cones. We can pinpoint them, but they do give rise to novel causal elements. And that's what we call extended emergence. It's different than both weak and strong.
Yeah. So an example of sort of a strong emergentist framework that strikes me would be like Noam Chomsky's model of the origin of a recursive language, right? Essentially, there's a moment where there's non-linguistic creatures, and then
a hopeful monster, as some of the critiques calls it. Yep, a hopeful monster. But yes, he was very hostile to the idea that would be stitched together by natural selection, and that would be a good example of sort of a miracle of strong emergence almost. Yep.
Mm-hmm. Now, I feel like I'm sort of smacking up against the limits of my knowledge a little bit here, but there's a curiosity that arises in me about the sense that, like, a hard emergentist frame seems in some sense to be maybe downstream of an information processing model of cognition. So, recently I've been reading The Blind Spot by Evan Thompson, and,
love it.
And I've been reading J.J. Gibson. And of course, in my work, right, as a movement teacher, where I kind of link up with a lot of this is in bringing, ecological dynamics, motor learning theory from that frame. And, what's brilliant about Gibson is sort of saying, and it's really interesting to read those together, right? You end up with this place where it's like, okay, we abstract out a way of thinking about the world in physics that gives us certain tool-like capacities. Sure. However, it doesn't describe very well what we actually experience. And if we try to then go back to the mind from the abstracted physics, we end up with really incoherent models of how the mind actually works. And what Gibson did was he basically looked at what the mind is actually operating in. So, if we think about something like wetness, if we take direct perception theory seriously, right, wetness is a property of the environment that is highly salient to an organism. And of course, an organism would need to be aware of wetness, and it would evolve a system that is going to be able to pick up that salience in the landscape. And it's picking up something that is actually fundamentally real. So when we tell me if I'm just completely off base here, but it seems like when someone is looking at that and saying, okay, that's qualia has to be sort of just a totally mysterious thing, they're imagining a mind that has to sort of extract all the information from the environment rather than the information being an inherent relationship to this agent arena relationship. Does that make sense?
Totally.
Very good.
I mean, so you talk, obviously I'm paired with John. John's, 4E cognitive science, so ecological Gibson work and the entire 4E embedded, embodied Evan Thompson, mind and life kind of elements. That's all. So for us, and me in particular, my answer is, okay, the system is missing, the system of academic knowledge is missing the concept of mindedness. Okay. Mindedness is like life. It's the complex adaptive system of sensory motor loops. Certainly Evan Thompson's pointing it in life and mind, and the entire 4E cognitive science model that's different from, so if you go back to the history of, you got to start with psychology, actually. Psychology is trying to grip, and we have the problem of psychology, and then behaviorism comes along and says, F it. Right? All we are is we're just going to track behavioral responses and how environmental contingencies relate to them. And any question what's going on in the so-called black box is either the brain or mysterious. So we're going to just X out, and everybody's like, well, whatever. But then behaviorism gets a hold. But then there's information processing models, right? There's the whole Turing, Shannon, and then the exploration. Actually, a couple things emerge. There's cybernetic control systems and then formal computational systems. But formal computational systems end up taking hold, and then they try to run a intelligence through computational system. And then cognitive psychology basically says, oh, it's some kind of formal computational process, or at least an arm of cognitive psychology does that. Okay. Then you get phase one of the cognitive revolution really is, oh, this is just a symbolic processor. Really, somehow there's symbols that are instantiated in the system. It's an algorithmic processor. Well, that was phase one. And then phase two was actually, no, it's a neural network. We build neural networks in the computers and we see their weighted structures as opposed to symbolic structures. And then they plastically rearrange themselves. That's actually what neural networks are doing in the real neural networks. And we can model them computationally. That's connectionism. But no, that's still an abstraction. You actually have an embodied sensory motor looping structure that learns through the process by which it actually behaves within the context of environments, embedded, embodied, etc. And that's 4E cognitive science. When you talk language, that's actually mindedness. So mindedness refers to the sensory motor loop in animals with brains and complex active bodies. It says that because of prey and predation emerges as a Cambrian explosion, we have an early pre-minded or almost minded bilateral body plan with worms. And then the Cambrian explosion happens and boom, you get a complex, adaptive, active system that's running around in the world. And that's what mindedness fundamentally is, as its complex adaptive system. And yes, the nervous system is broadly defined an information processing system, but it doesn't reduce to a symbolic processor. It doesn't even reduce to an isolated connectome system. It is an embodied, embedded, extended, enacting system of mindedness. That's what John and I argue, and that there's a dimension of mindedness, the mind animal dimension in the world that we've been basically blind to, because the Enlightenment Gap actually splits knowing mind from known object. And we don't have the right structure to place the subjective knowing mind in the objective behaving world, but we do now, at least within naturalism. We don't need to split. There's just grammar mistake after grammar, conceptual grammar mistake after conceptual grammar mistake as a function of the Enlightenment Gap and the failure to appreciate the right relationship between subjective mindedness and the objective behavioral world.
That was a lot.
Anyway, I've been working a lot on this stuff lately, so it comes out pretty fast.
There's a lot of things that I could double click on there. One of the, I guess, what's left for me that's popping for salience there is when we hit Cartesian dualism, right? And we split the subjective from the objective. We have the idea of the reasoning mind, and we have the idea of the environment, and then essentially the animal layer of the self is where the intersection between these things actually is, but we kind of lose it. Totally. So I really love sort of Jordan Peterson's stuff in Maps of Meaning and the lectures from 2017. And one of the things that really struck me, especially as someone who comes from a movement base, is he said something like, emotions are downstream of action tendencies. In the beginning of Maps of Meaning, he says, meaning fundamentally is signification for action.
Totally.
Right? It's going to work or it's not. And so I like when I build my model of what a human is, or it starts with this fundamental thing that you have to have a motivational state. So you're not a poetic creature. You have aversion and an appetite. That's the fundamental underlying, binary of reality. And then you have these complex emotions that evolve to guide us in relationship to appetite and aversion, and how we're sort of navigating the environment, which becomes first the physical environment, then the social environment. And then I think the layer that's striking me here is, so at some point we can exchange genes, right? Bacteria can move gene packages around. We become adaptive organisms by doing that. Then at the cultural layer, essentially we develop the capacity through symbolic language to exchange mimetic information, right? Mm-hmm. So one of the things I was listening to, Unity of Knowledge, I think was the podcast you were on. I was listening to your interview with Unity of Knowledge, and we're talking about the influence of evolutionary psychology and sort of how you are integrating evolutionary psychology at the beginning of the UTOC system. And I find that interesting because, as I said, I was interested in evolutionary psychology around the same time. I actually just messaged John Vervaeke a few weeks ago and said, has anybody tried to add a seventh E to the 6E? Because he has 6 E's now of cognitive science, the evolutionary aspect of it, right? And he was like, oh, maybe we should do that. And I was like, I don't think I have the academic chops to jump in with you and try to write a paper, or the time or ability to read and write fast enough, but very flattering. But that's
right. I mean, I totally agree. Well, I mean, first off, I'll just say, yes, UTOC already does that. I mean, UTOC's behavioral investment theory. So the joint point between living organisms in UTOC and minded animals is called behavioral investment theory. Okay, that's the joint point. And what it basically says is that animals had more and more opportunity to navigate what Michael Levin now recently refers to as 3D behavioral space. Behavior. Okay, but really, bacteria behave. So what do you mean? Oh, we mean actually normative space for our sized objects. That's really what we mean. And what we mean is that you are actually a multicellular entity that has muscle, a segmented body that can run around and either eat or get eaten. I mean, that's appetitive and aversive or investment value systems. Okay. And the first principle of behavioral investment theory is the energy economic principle. Okay. Which basically says you need to regulate the body budget relative to cost benefit of work effort. So that's the first principle. And the second principle is evolution. Okay. Principle of evolution. And third principle is principle of behavioral genetics. So behavioral investment theory basically takes behavioral ecology, sociobiology, evolutionary psychology, binds them together with behavioral science, cognitive science, neuroscience, and now actually binds it together with recursive relevance realization. Because basically what it then says is ultimately what's emerging is the agent arena relationship to navigate paths of investment. And then it achieves that through recursive relevance realization, which is a hierarchical predictive processing system. So if you take me and John together, you have your E for sure at the level of what is the recursive relevance realization doing evolutionarily? It's organized structurally as a behavioral investment system, phylogenetically, and then developmentally or ontogenetically. That's what, so you can then behavioral investing, what? Appetites, aversions as a function of what? Reproductive success, survival, and then a few other things you want to sort of, that's a little bit simplistic, but for this purposes, that's a good place to start.
Yeah. So strikes me as interesting at this layer is, or where I want to go is, if I go back to being, undergrad in anthropology, right? You had these kind of you had old physical anthropology, which largely didn't exist anymore. You had kind of archaeology, paleo anthropology, where you're just looking at the bones and everything. Right then you had Milford Wilpoff arguing with, what was it, Trinkhaus? I can't remember who the out of Africa versus.
Right, of course. I remember that. What happened to the Neanderthals? Exactly.
Yeah.
Another thing.
And so you had those areas, and then you largely had cultural evolution, and then the cultural evolution people were very, very anti, or not cultural evolution, no, cultural anthropology, and then you had the sort of evolutionary psych, and the cultural
biological anthropology,
sociobiology, and evolutionary psychology was reductive and essentialist and evil, and going to give rise to Nazi Germany again. And then you had I was really influenced in my, like, when I was 19 by Marvin Harris, cultural materialism.
I remember that.
There's a set of constraints provided by the economy and the ecology, and the culture has to evolve in some sense in relationship to that. You want to understand why pigs are forbidden as food in certain cultures. It's probably downstream of the pathogens that are common in that environment.
Totally.
Though that turns out not to necessarily be the case. We don't really know why pigs are forbidden, but at least it's a rational.
That's what. No, I understand the cultural materials frame.
Yeah,
right.
And what I was interested was, there was a point at which I was sort of like, culture is this god of the gaps, and then I was like, well, maybe there is explanatory power in culture. And so I think it kind of maps onto yours, but it was like, we have to understand the underlying biological constraints, right? Like fundamental things like metabolism, right? Like how, you won't have a culture of people who run 100% of the time because the human body can't handle it. And, people in a environment like, a tropical rainforest that is extremely humid are not going to persistence hunt because they can't shed the heat burden. Right.
You have to maintain the living organism layer of complexification. If you don't do that, then everything else that's contingent upon that fails for sure.
Yeah. So you have a causal pathway from like fundamental physical things, right? Like we won't have a culture of people who fly because it's just not something we can do unless, talk about airplanes, but human flight. So you have your underlying biological constraints. And then, what was always interesting to me was I, I think the gender and sex debate was always really fascinating because you could see that as I started to read lots of ethnography, and I read like probably 30 ethnographies between the time I was 12 and 16 years old because I got access to a friend's library. So when I went into my first like intro to anth classes and people were saying stuff, I was like, that doesn't make sense. Like you're mischaracterizing how the Kung and the Mbuti actually behave. You're like, oh, they're egalitarians. And I'm like, well, I remember, the scene in the Forest People where, where Turnbull's guide beats his sister up because she won't marry someone in the next tribe because he wants to marry their sister, right? Like, it's like, oh, that doesn't seem very egalitarian to me. But my point is that there was this very strange thing, which was that human male and female behavioral differences cross-culturally largely resemble behavioral differences between males and females in lions and chimps and across the board. It's like, well, there's some fundamental constraints here that are shared. And I was being asked to believe in the cultural anthropology space that all of those things just happened to emerge, that evolution sort of jettisoned all of human nature 50,000 years ago. And then we just happened to evolve the same pattern that every other sexed species has, or not every other, but the vast majority of sexed species.
Absolutely.
So at some point I was just like, these guys are just out to lunch. Like they don't even want to have a theory of human knowledge. They just want, they want to have fun stories about other cultures and be able to maybe look down on their own culture. I called it the menagerie approach to anthropology.
Well, I went through that in psychology almost identically. I can tell you the story about on gender and bought the behavioral environmental feminist view until I discovered evolutionary psychology and was like, my God, actually, I don't understand evolution. And then I didn't understand us as primates. And then I did. And then I realized how much bullshit all that is.
Yeah, we have to understand ourselves as primates, as mammals, right?
Right. No, we're primates, we're mammals, we're animals, we're organisms, for sure.
So, but I got to the point where I realized that, so you can explain, like if you want to know why men and women are different in between different cultures, then your best explanation is, gametes and, sexual investment theory and division of labor due to how evolution shaped different bodies. Human beings are actually really fascinating because we are the most differentiated in many ways in division of labor between males and females. And we also have the most maternal males of pretty much any mammal species. And so there's a weird way in which we're one of the most differentiated species behaviorally and one of the most similar. But you can explain that at that level, but you cannot go to biology to explain why, or it doesn't seem to me that you can go to biology to explain why some regions of India are Muslim and some regions of India are Hindu.
Clearly.
But when you go to the ideology of Islam or the cultural package of Islam or the cultural package of Hinduism, cultural package of Christianity, you see that there's explanatory power there. That whether you marry your cousins and on which side of your family you marry your cousins on, that's the ideological now downstreaming back to the biological. So at the time I wanted to create a blog called Complex Interplay, right, which is about how you have these multiple emergent layers and how those layers then have feedback loops.
Yep.
So that was a bit of a tangential rant about it, but I thought it was interesting how I was thinking about this stuff when I was an undergrad, kind of around the same time that you were. So I'm curious how you integrated the evolutionary into this model. And then I think where I want to go is now, how does that once we have the biological in proper relationship to the culture, in proper relationship to the underlying physical, what does that imply about how we actually solve psychology and philosophy, not as theoretical things, but as actual pragmatic systems of being able to help people live better lives?
Yeah, well, that's a okay. So when I did my thing, I was like, oh, hey, we need a big picture frame for psychology, and I didn't even realize I was doing it. I started zooming back and found evolutionary theory. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
and UTalk is grounded. Its whole scientific model is the big picture scientific model. It's called the Tree of Knowledge system, as we've talked about, and it is an evolutionary model. But it's a little different than the evolutionary models. Listen to how you're talking about it. Oh, it's biological and cultural evolution.
Mm-hmm.
No, that's wrong. That's not right. Okay.
Okay.
Because biology refers to the second dimension of complexification. Culture really needs to get differentiated into society, and capital C culture, our ideologies, our justification systems. That is part of our stack. Our technologies aren't, although they're feeding back.
Okay. We got to stop for a second. Sorry,
Yeah.
because we need to double click on justification systems, because that's an important part of the kind of structure of your theory that I understand, but the audience doesn't understand.
Right. So the argument of UTalk, the first key idea that leads to the whole UTalk system, is the idea. I'm in evolutionary psychology, and I'm learning how to think about what's called reverse engineering, which is when you see complexity, you wonder what that complexity is for. Is it an accidental byproduct of something else? Does it come from something else? Or is it there to solve a particular kind of problem? Okay. And then I had an insight in 1996, before the Tree of Knowledge. I had an insight that when talking shifted from symbolic tagging, so their antelope, to propositional, the Chomsky shift, which is now an open syntactical symbolic recursive system that generates statements. Okay. When it says there are the antelope versus antelope there. There are the antelopes of proposition. Antelope there has to be inferred what you mean. It doesn't have a binding positive meaning value. It's just inferred through association. There are the antelope has a binding propositional meaning. Okay. When you create a binding propositional meaning, a positive meaning, what actually happens, and you think about this in a dialectical sense, then by creating positive meaning, you actually open up negative space around it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Like, as you assert that is to be the case, you then create a counterfactual vacuum around it, meaning that it might not be the case. Okay? By virtue of stating, you get positive meaning, and then by virtue of positive meaning, there's a negative vacuum around it. What I realized is that the negative vacuum then would be filled in by a new cognitive gadget called a question. Why, who, what, when, where, and what's the alternative? Those kinds of issues, which create then the question answer dynamic, which I realize to be the generative function that gives rise to us turning from primates that could symbolically tag stuff and coordinate to persons that could then justify our actions and develop a rationale for why we do what we do and create an intersubjective network of systems of justification that would legitimize is and ought for the group. Okay. And then these become shared systems of belief, propositional network systems of belief that then coordinate our lower level, if you want to call them that, behavioral investment patterns, which we would share with other animals. And so culture actually then is the shared learned behavioral investment patterns that then is nested and bound together through the propositional networks, which I then saw as the systems of justification that create a socially constructed shared reality, at least mediated through propositions. And that's capital C culture. And that gives rise to the culture person plane of existence. And that is the process by which we turn ourselves into primates, into persons who are also still primates, but we're then persons that can then justify, be held accountable, and are networked together in that space. So that's justification systems theory in a nutshell.
Okay, so what I think I heard you say was, in some sense, when we invent the capacity, or when we develop the capacity for propositional exchange, we essentially open up a new level of being, let's say, that is the intersubjective, that prior to that, we don't really have a meaningful intersubjective space.
We don't have an explicit intersubjective. There is a shared, and we can look at primates, and Michael Tomasello's done really good primate anthropological work on this in the shares. Actually, we can have shared attention and intention that is a nonverbal intersubjective coordination that we can get together in groups, play music, coordinate hunting to a degree, but we lack what propositional networks and question answer dynamics do, gives us an explicit intersubjective propositionally binding structure.
So an explicit sort of symbolic intersubjective space is opened up. Now,
that's right.
So this insight, I'm curious, because this is interesting about sort of the predictive value of your theory. So you say essentially primates can tag symbolically, right? They can yell hawk and point.
Definitely.
But they cannot engage in question and answer.
They can't engage in elaborate question answer dynamics. Absolutely.
So I have, unfortunately, I didn't kind of double click through. I keep using that analogy, the double clicking, but I just recently came across this finding that in the entire history of sign language with chimps and orangutans and gorillas, no chimp, orangutan, or gorilla has ever asked a question.
Yep. Was
that something you were familiar with when you?
No, I learned that. I know there's a. I think it's there's a dissertation as any other animal asks a question. There is an argument that Alex the Great Parrot asks questions. I don't know if you're familiar with Alex the Great Parrot, but in relationship to other primates, there is an argument that no other primates ask a question. I actually almost tested this. For a couple of years, I had a pretty good relationship with Sue Savage Rumbaugh. She taught Kanzi, the bonobo, and I explained this idea to her. She said, maybe I think he can ask questions and answer, but she couldn't document really clear behavioral evidence of it. I almost went to the Great Ape Trust with the project to determine whether or not Kanzi would be in a position to ask and answer questions. Unfortunately, politics or whatever, she got into a bit of a fight with the Great Ape Trust, and our project got canceled in relationship to before it got really seeded. But the seeds of the idea were there. So at least as far as Sue Savage Rumbaugh was concerned, who sort of advocates for, at least within primate language, sort of the most expansive capacities for primate language. She believes that there's an enormous amount of, in fact, she co-authored papers with other primates, which I thought was a little bit of an exaggeration. So she believes that there's an enormous untapped mind and minded intersubjective structure. So she would say, no, Greg, I think you're wrong. But in terms of behavioral evidence, there wasn't good evidence. And I think the scientific community, certainly a skeptical scientific community, generally sides with me on this. I was hoping to really test it and find out. But I would argue that the evidence for question answer dynamics in other animals is very small.
Okay. So once we open up this explicit symbolic intersubjective space, then essentially we have the preconditions by which evolution can now operate in that space and generate distinct cultural packages that become adaptive to specific circumstances, and then become themselves causal factors in the evolution of the biology of the underlying populations, creating their own unique sort of behavioral ecologies.
Totally.
So if we understand this, I think it has some interesting political implications that are difficult, but I don't want to get into that. Let's avoid that one.
All right, let's not double click there, or else over here. Okay.
I'm going to undouble click on that.
I'll unclick that. Fair enough.
Ignore that one. But, my work predominantly is really about how we. I think I said this to you on your podcast when I was on your podcast, but ultimately, so I do parkour, grow older, start asking, why am I jumping on things? Why am I risking injury? What am I doing? It's like, okay, well, somehow it's very meaningful. Why is it meaningful? Look at people and say, hey, okay, is parkour unique in its capacity to address meaning? It's like, well, I talk to jujitsus and soteros and surfers and all this. And everybody who loves a practice kind of says similar things, right? Mm-hmm. It's transformational, it's character developing. so then okay, we're actually really after meaning. That's really what we're after here, because if you're 45 and you're practicing jiu-jitsu, you're probably not going to be a world champion, right?
Right. If that's what meaning is and that's what you need, then
Yeah.
maybe it'll come up a little short then.
Like there's a sort of finite game mentality that we as young people tend to adopt in relationship to every sport, where it's like, okay, I'm just climbing the hierarchy until I peak out, and then that's the end game, and then I'll move on to something else.
Yeah.
Then some people peak out and don't move on to something else, and the question is why, right? It's like somehow it's meaningful. So over many years of then interacting with Jordan Peterson stuff, interacting with John Vervaeke stuff, I came to this sort of fundamental conclusion that every practice is actually, in some sense, a way of falling in love with being. And that ultimately, if we can build an ecology of practices, that's the capacity to fall in love with being. So what I've argued with John and with other folks is that philosophy really takes a hard wrong turn when it collapses itself into the mind and ignores the body and the underlying emotional aspect of the human being. And that if we are to be wise and to love wisdom, we have to integrate the body. We have to integrate the underlying emotional systems. So that's my argument is essentially that we can practice in such a way that we engage reciprocally opening dynamics across the entire set of necessary connections that a being has with the world. And that if we do that, that's an experience of falling in love, and that's redemptive, and that basically is the pathway to the kingdom of heaven here on earth. So that it's a small claim, but yeah. So what I'm curious about here is I heard you say also in that Unity of Knowledge podcast that the evidence that say cognitive behavioral therapy is actually superior to therapy in general, or to say psychodynamic therapy or Freudian analysis or whatever it is very weak. And I've seen that same argument from Scott Alexander, Slate Star Codex. Are you familiar with Scott Alexander? Yeah. He had a wonderful essay called like the control group is out of control, which is about how like the least scientifically justified theory in psychology performs pretty much as well as the most scientifically justified.
So, yep, there's a whole, part of UTalk is what's called the Common Core. The Common Core psychotherapy says that there's a lot more knowledge about what the basic ingredients of psychotherapy are, and you don't find it's not in the brands per se. So you have to be very wary of brands. They're useful in certain contexts, but they're useful if a brand is shouting at you, it almost certainly is. It's fell and capture to selling rather than actual evidence.
Okay, so the question here is, if you have UTalk as a foundation, what is the pragmatic output in how we understand the process of therapy or the process of self-cultivation?
Yeah, so right. So now UTech is fundamentally about clarifying what is, cultivating what ought to be. Okay, that's and the sort of ultimate then justifications do that. They specify what is and they bind that together to what legitimizing what ought to be. The big picture view is that it places this thing called the garden, which tries to cultivate wise living, both knowledge, sort of what you could call the mind, but I would call the abstractions that legitimize. We need clarity about those types of things. And then we need to embody wise living. So it's both philosophia and phronesis in relationship, right relation. It also says things like, hey, we're minded animals as much as we're cultured persons, and our lives unfold as minded animals. So when I think evolve, move, play, because we're minded animals, right? And we forget, and the idea of discourse, Rene Descartes' Meditations and Discourse. It's like, okay, we're just going to abstract true knowledge through that's a blind spot kind of error. We are embodied in acting that's our whole how many 70 cognitive science, whatever structure. Behavioral investment theory makes that crystal clear in relation. And so those are there's a certain lessons. There are more specific lessons then, because I'm a psychotherapist, and in particular, I'm concerned with neurotic problems. Okay, so neurotic problems are the way individuals try to adapt to the world in general. And then there's the flourishing side of that. How successful are you to create reciprocal opening in relationship to affording you they're maximizing potentials and getting a job and getting a partner and managing and then dealing with this life suffering and all of that. So there's pragmatic, real structures. And then there's the way in which you adjust to the world, especially when it hits you. Utah argues that essentially what happens to people that makes them vulnerable, well, there's a lot of vulnerabilities that's a stage, but here's the basic adaptive or maladaptive process, which is negative events happen, then you have negative feelings. So there's a negative event, negative feeling. And then unfortunately, we don't teach people how to effectively relate to the negative event, negative feeling structure. We don't teach enough about emotion. We don't teach enough about, we have a problematic value system. And that it sets the stage for a negative reaction to the negative event, negative situation. Negative here means maladaptive. So people avoid stuff. They blame themselves or others. They engage in misguided control. If you create a negative reaction, maladaptive reaction to a negative situation, negative feeling, you create a neurotic loop, which is a reciprocal narrowing around trying to get a hold of something that you're not metabolizing or growing from. And in so doing, that pulls you further and further into what we call the cave of behavioral shutdown, which is the metaphorical reciprocal narrowing that boxes you in as you try to control something, escape from something, blame yourself and out of it, or blame other people, blame the world out of it. So we call that the ABCs of negative loop, neurotic loops, and makes it vulnerable to anxiety and depression. You look at virtually all the models, behavioral models, which are basically maladaptive habits of trying to misguided control, emotional models, which are avoidance and inability, relational models, defense models, cognitive models. They all basically say, hey, the way you get triggered by stuff, you have bad maladaptive ways of adapting, and that prevents you from growing. And then what you need to do is stop that. Okay. But the first thing before you really just stop it, because you can't just stop it, you actually become aware. So you have to shift your perspective from being reactively to it into a metacognitive perspective that looks at it. So you can then be reflective and responsive about it. That's a metacognitive move. And then instead of being critical, resistant, tense, controlling, judgmental, you then bring a curiosity, accepting, loving, compassionate, and motivated toward valued states of being. Actually, here's, I got one right here. It's called a Calm MO. It's a Calm MO flashlight that you shine on neurotic loops. And so what UTalk says is, hey, actually, the wisdom of the therapy room, there's a lot of wisdom, but it's actually kind of grandmother type wisdom. It's like, really? No shit. I was like, well, actually, and we know empirically that's really the process. It's that psychotherapy brings you in. If you have somebody that can listen to you well, gives you respect, has novel ways for you to look at your situation that opens up you to believe in your potential, explore various things, and create feedback loops that allow you to be motivated toward value states of being, that's what good therapy is. And psychodynamic, family systems, cognitive behavioral, once you account for what we call the common core, okay, you basically account for the primary findings of psychotherapy. Whether you get narrow differences in certain domains is an interesting one. Certain kind of, PTSD with what's called eye movement desensitization therapy. There's some argument that says that's actually a little better than the common core. We argue to the control point in our book, and our approach to the common core is actually what we first should do is train all the control therapists on what we know the common core to be, which is listen, show respect, and shift people from negative reactivity to calm MO. That's what that would. Then after that, you may need specialized intervention, but everybody should get the generalized intervention. If you have a brand, my argument would be, show me that your brand does better than the common core. Okay, that should be the control group because that's the common knowledge that we actually already have. And if you apply that skillfully, I think you get 90% of the effect of what psychotherapy offers. And then maybe in certain cases, obsessive compulsive disorder, PTSD, anorexia, there's certain kinds of things that a specialized therapist may need to know. And if you actually have that knowledge, you can do incrementally better than the common core. But what we don't have is the common core. And instead we have CBT versus humanistic versus psychodynamic. And that's a big mistake. We should actually distribute the common core knowledge about neurotic loops and transforming them with something like Calm MO and psychological mindfulness, because that's actually what we know arises and works.
So the theory to me sounds something like the agent, the autopoietic self, inherently is going to always have the potential, will inevitably run into aversive stimulation. Aversive stimulation can give rise to adaptive behavior or maladaptive behavior to try to control that. Now, the role of feeling states, I think, is really interesting because I just, again, I could have done a deeper read on this, but if you look at maybe something like Stoicism, CBT, it seems like the goal is simply to sort of reduce the salience of the negative feeling system.
Mm-hmm.
And there's some research that just came out that said, like, learning to ignore negative thoughts improves well-being. And I've been through a lot of therapy in the last year and a half, and that's been precisely the opposite of my experience, right? What was healing for me was being able to access extremely deeply held somatic experiences of emotion that I literally was in denial that I had,
Yep.
right?
Sure.
I've had irritable bowel syndrome since I was in my early teens. And I have vitiligo, which is probably emotionally, and I've had chronic fatigue for the last 15 years or so. And so I was sexually abused in my early teens, and
Okay.
I basically just thought I got away scot-free. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I was just like, okay, like,
Mm-hmm.
I don't seem to be that kinked by it. I'm
Mm-hmm.
successfully married and all that stuff.
Yep.
And then when my wife broke up with me, it's like,
Yep.
why are you? What have I done that's upset you? And she's like, okay, well, this, and this. It's like, oh, that doesn't sound very good. That's not cool. Why would I do that? Like, I love you, and then maybe I did behave in some of these ways, and then okay, well, where could that have come from? It came from this, and then okay, I got to go confront that. And so, essentially, I ended up doing 6 weeks of 6 days a week of IFS therapy.
Okay.
And 1 day a week of somatic therapy, doing a lot of eye movement desensitization.
Good.
And then at the end of that 6 weeks, I did an MDMA therapy session. And then 8 weeks later, a second MDMA therapy session, etc. And the MDMA therapy was essentially just, it felt like I got to, it was like deep in my body, all those emotions that I never processed were still available. And the MDMA just opened the channel up. And then I essentially tremored intensely for 4 hours. I was like that for 4 hours and screaming and grunting and cursing. But after that, like the ability to notice and be sort of have greater equanimity in response to those negative stimulations that would have driven me over threshold was massively increased. So there's a couple things that came out of that for me. One is I don't think that I could have done what I did except for the base of physical practice that I had. I think my body had to be physically strong enough, and I had to be psychologically strong enough through the courage that was developed by jumping and fighting for years to get to that point.
Yep.
Though also dancing to sort of dance in the somatic and softening to open, to surrender into. But took a combination of those. According to the therapist that I work with, so I guess about 3% of people who do MDMA therapy experience intense tremors or experience tremors. But according to the therapist that I worked with, they'd never seen anybody who tremored as intensely as me and who screamed as intensely as I did.
Wow.
And I mean, maybe it's just, people respond differently. But part of me thinks it was like, okay, I sort of was really prepared physically to have the strength to allow such an extreme physical charge to move through me.
Sure.
So my sense is that a lot of our trauma, it's not so much that we experience worse things than people have experienced in the past. It's that we're much less capable of properly discharging or allowing or being present to the emotion that moves through us in that. And it seems like Western culture is essentially sort of stuck in a cognitive or a rationalist neuroses where we think that we can control and move away from emotion by thinking and by propositional control. And that's exactly what I noticed in myself. That was what made me an intolerable partner to my wife, was that it was that her emotion I couldn't show up for and I wanted to rationalize away.
Yep.
So I'm curious what comes up for you as I sort of like lay out that story and that perception of maybe the neuroses of Western culture, because we're seeing increased depression, increased anxiety, all of these things, while, ultimately with attachment is a problem, right? The way that we are showing up for children. But as far as like our likelihood of being raped, murdered, assaulted, being starving, having a bad disease, like all these things that we would think are like our sources of trauma, we're experiencing way less of than in the past.
Totally.
And yet we're behaving as if we are much more traumatized.
Totally.
And so what do you think about this theory that the reason we behave as if we are more traumatized is because we have adopted a frame in which we are trying to rationalize through rather than having the literal physical capacity and faith to actually move through the feeling states that we experience?
Yeah, well, a lot there. Certainly, Utah says a lot about that. First of all, thanks for sharing your, you're making it real and making it personal, and you're giving your version. So, when we shift from the unified theory of psychology, the first basic structure for the unified approach is to recognize the human system as layers of adaptation that evolved. Okay, the first is the habit layer. Okay, which then binds to basic procedural memory and the strength of the body in particular contexts, craving, stimulus, triggers that are essentially pretty non-conscious procedural structures. Okay, that can then basically all repeated things can get baked into that. And then on top of that is the first order experiencing system, which is where your emotions lie. Okay, or in terms of the way in which as input comes in, you have then a motivational referent and then feelings. Well, as you respond to them, feel good or bad. Okay. And then this is your core animal structure. Core animal structure is a habit feeling system. Okay. You're a primate. The next system is your relationship system. So this is your attachment system. This is how do you manage competition, cooperation, and connectedness with your romantic partner, with your peers, friends, in groups, and then ultimately with yourself, because we humans then have an egoic narrator on top of a core primate self. Okay. And then between the egoic narrator and top of the core is your defensive system. Okay. Your psychological defensive system. And we can look at the psychodynamic people really delineating what are the core defensive mechanisms by which we'll block off certain pieces of our structure. Okay. And if we block them off in ways, then all of a sudden we can't metabolize them. Okay. Yeah. And if you don't metabolize certain things, you can get off scot-free sometimes, and sometimes you can't. Okay. And then it really depends on how you are then interacting with the world and what is the blind spot that you have in your own structure. And I'm not speaking to you specifically, but if you blocked off shit, then you've got then you can't learn for a whole host of complicated reasons. Essentially, it prevents you from getting feedback because as soon as you get data on it, then it activates anxiety and the anxiety shifts. And that's the repressive aspect of it. And then it creates a justificatory rationalizing structure that moves around it, but it doesn't then contact the original stimulus. So you can't learn around this particular issue, and you develop threat signals to what it is, and it lives inside of you in particular ways. And absolutely, it's crystal clear that we have core emotional memories that need to be reconsolidated for a lot of people in order to feel whole. Okay, memory reconsolidation. In terms of the mechanisms of therapy, what I was talking about here is the context process elements. The core mechanisms of therapy, when you get actually what's called a corrective emotional shift, is a lot of what you're describing, which is access to old injuries, metabolic experiences about one's core, one's vulnerabilities, one's traumas, one's relationships with others that have not been processed, brought through the stage, contacted, felt, and then reframed in a particular way, and then dropped back in the system in a new, that has all sorts of new meanings around it. Then that memory then is now integrated in the system and it interacts differently. So the bottom line is you become a much more complexified whole. Okay. Yeah. And then you feel freer. I mean, IFS talks essentially about this. You have all these different potential states and a core, the potential self state that can relate to all of these as a higher order centered structure, but doesn't exist that way often if you're injured or you haven't gone, you go through a particular process, you get a higher order consolidation of a centralized self relative to the various elements of the, defenders and managers and, whatever split off traumatized elements, etc. So what I would certainly say, UTOC certainly says, is the defensive system will block certain particular kinds of elements. It will do that adaptively in the short term, but it makes you limited in certain particular ways. If that interacts with your environment so that you can't reach potential, then there'll be a sense of frustration. If you're blocked to that, ultimately uncovering that and remetabolizing that to get reconstituted is necessary. So I would hear your story through that lens. It is certainly the case that one of our tasks, and you asked about kind of the mental health crisis, It's getting right relationship to head and heart, okay, and really head, heart, body, which is like my justifying ego, relative to my primate core experiencing self, relative to my organismic self, and then relative to you. In other words, self, other, world relation. How do we effectively get that in harmony? We're way out of harmony at multiple levels, okay? And one of the things we used to do is do a lot of repression and intellectualization. But in the therapy world recently, what I would say, the other thing we need to be aware of is, we also opened up an enormous amount of, in attention to people's subjective feelings. Oh, you feel bad about this. Oh, the world's really unfair. You're likely to be abused. You're likely to be oppressed. Tell about this. Hopefully we'll try to change it. Let everybody know I've been vulnerable to microaggressions, etc. So the fundamental issue is, what's the right relationship between head and heart? When do we repress regulatorily? When do we open up? What is the process by which we exchange with other people? And how do we manage our filtrations when we need to? And how do we maintain those filtrations so they're adaptively cohering across our our complexified spaces as biological organisms, minded animals, and cultured people, persons? That's essentially what UTalk says is the adaptive path to doing, being, and becoming, and their processes by which we do that. We can get directed away from that, avoidance, blocking, etc. You need a particular, for deep layered avoidance elements, you would need a deep layered process to gain access and reconceptualize that core emotional stuff, break through the defenses, reconceptualize, and afford a new reorganizing, self-organizing structure.
Absolutely. I think we're going to have to end there. That was a whirlwind of intellectual content. Thank you, Greg.
Happy to do it. Appreciate the conversation. I know there's a lot coming at, UTalk is a pretty thick, complexified system across a wide variety of different domains, but I appreciate the tour.
Yeah, I really appreciated the conversation and look forward to future discussions. You mentioned at the beginning of the call you have a seminar online coming up with John Vervaeke, I believe, on Transcendent Naturalism.
Yeah, actually, it's on extended naturalism. The two parts of Transcendent. We're not going to be touching strong transcendence later. That's more sort of the community potential of, how do we come together and transcend our current structure, and how do we create meaning culturally? The extended naturalism part is like, how do we bridge the Enlightenment gap? How do we actually afford a worldview that enables us to put mind and matter within a naturalistic view that's actually coherent? We don't have that. So extended naturalism gives us an opportunity to do that. That's April 25th and 26th. We'll be getting flyers out to everybody. I've been letting my little network know, but we got Michael Levin, Benita Roy, Alexander Bard, Layman Pascal, a lot of the key players in this space coming over and talking about this. April 25th, 26th online. We'll get some information out on that.
Awesome. And then your website, Unified Theory of Knowledge, or UTalk?
Yep, I'll send you. Yep, it's just UTalk, UnifiedTheoryOfKnowledge.com. We got a new website there. I got a new book, the UTalk, The Unified Theory of Knowledge, and I can send you some links or whatever, but you can just Google that and should be able to find it.
Put them in the show notes. Thank you very much, and we'll see each other again soon.
I appreciate the heartfelt, wide-ranging conversation very much.